The brown envelope fell from Leah's trembling fingers, its contents scattered across her hardwood floor like pieces of a shattered mirror, each document reflecting a truth she wasn't prepared to see. The rain drummed against the gallery windows with a persistence that matched Leah's restless energy. She moved through the crowded photography exhibit, her camera hanging around her neck like a familiar weight, capturing candid moments between strangers who would never know they'd been immortalized. In her lens, the black and white portraits on the walls spoke to her raw, honest faces that revealed more than their subjects probably intended. "Like I'm 6, a voice asked behind her. Leah turned to find a man studying her camera with genuine interest, not the casual curiosity most people showed. He had dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, thoughtful eyes, and the kind of quiet confidence that drew her attention immediately. He wasn't trying to impress her, just genuinely curious about her equipment. 1984, she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to talk to him. Found it at an estate sale in Brooklyn. The previous owner had kept it in perfect condition. Film photography in a digital world, he mused. Stepping closer. There's something honest about it. You can't take back a shot once you've pressed the shutter. His name was Eli, and within minutes, Leah found herself genuinely engaged in conversation for the first time in months. They talked about the weight of vintage cameras, the intimacy of darkroom development, and how digital photography, while convenient, sometimes felt too forgiving. He collected old cameras himself not to use them, but to preserve pieces of history that most people had forgotten. As they wandered through the exhibit together, Leah noticed how he moved through the space with the same careful observation she did. He didn't just look at the photographs, he studied them, understanding the stories they told beyond their surface beauty. When they stopped in front of a particularly haunting portrait of an elderly woman's weathered hands, Eli was quiet. For a long moment. "She's holding something," he said finally, "or maybe letting something go." Leah looked at him with new interest. Most people saw the technical aspects of photography: composition, lighting, contrast, but Eli saw the emotion, the narrative hidden in the shadows and the spaces between subjects. It was exactly how she approached her own work. They ended up at a late-night diner, talking over coffee that grew cold as their conversation deepened. Eli worked in tech, but had studied art history in college. He'd been adopted as an infant and raised by loving parents who'd encouraged his interests. But he'd always felt like something was missing, a connection to his origins that he could never quite place. Leah understood that feeling intimately. She'd grown up in foster care, moving between homes that never quite felt permanent. Photography had become her way of documenting temporary moments, making them last longer than they were meant to. She told Eli about her work, the moody portraits and documentary projects that captured people in their most unguarded moments. "It sounds like you're looking for something," Eli observed, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. "Aren't we all?" Leah replied, but she knew he was right. Her camera was both her shield and her search tool, helping her understand the world by freezing moments in time. When they finally left the diner, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets gleaming under the streetlights. Eli walked her to the subway station, and as they stood at the entrance, there was a moment of hesitation, the kind that happens when two people realize something significant has shifted between them. "I'd like to see you again," Eli said simply. Leah found herself nodding before she'd even considered the implications. There was something about him that felt familiar, safe in a way that made her want to lower her usual defenses. As she descended into the subway, she couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting wasn't coincidental, that somehow they were supposed to find each other. 3 weeks into knowing Eli, Leah realized she was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came with bad decisions or reckless behavior, but the quiet, terrifying trouble of falling for someone who made everything else fade into background noise. They'd seen each other almost every day since the gallery, and each encounter felt like discovering a new room in a house she thought she already knew. Eli had a way of listening that made Leah want to tell him things she'd never shared with anyone. Over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the village, she found herself talking about her childhood, not the sanitized version she usually offered, but the real story of moving between foster homes, of learning to pack light because nothing was permanent, of using her camera as a way to create connections when human ones felt too risky. "I think that's why I'm drawn to photography," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "It's about capturing moments before they disappear, making something temporary feel eternal." Eli nodded with an understanding that went beyond politeness. "I collect cameras for a similar reason, I think. They're objects that held someone else's memories. When I hold a camera that someone used to document their life, I feel connected to that history, even if I don't know the specific stories." He told her about his adoption, about loving parents who'd given him every opportunity but never quite filling the space where questions about his origins lived. Unlike some adoptees, he'd never felt compelled to search for his biological family until recently. Something about turning 30 had awakened a curiosity about where he'd come from. What traits were inherited versus learned? "Do you ever wonder if we're drawn to certain things because of genetics we don't know about?" Eli asked, cutting into his chicken. "Like, maybe I love photography because someone I've never met had the same passion." Leah paused mid-bite. She'd wondered the same thing countless times. Her foster parents had been kind but practical people with no artistic inclinations. Her love of visual storytelling had seemed to emerge from nowhere, fully formed and urgent. After dinner, they walked through Washington Square Park, where street performers were wrapping up their evening shows. Eli stopped to watch a chess game between two elderly men, and Leah used the opportunity to study his profile in the lamplight. There was something about the shape of his nose, the way he held his head when he was concentrating, that struck her as familiar. She'd been photographing people for years and had developed an eye for facial structures, family resemblances, the genetic threads that connected relatives. "My turn to ask a probing question," Leah said as they continued walking. "What scares you most about finding your biological family?" Eli was quiet for several steps. "That they won't want to know me. Or worse, that I'll find them and realize I was better off not knowing." "What about you? Ever think about looking for yours?" "Sometimes," Leah admitted. "But I've built my life around not needing anyone. I'm not sure I'm ready to risk that independence for answers that might not change anything." They'd reached her apartment building, but neither of them moved toward the entrance. The night air was warm, and the city hummed around them with its usual restless energy. Eli reached for her hand, and the contact sent a jolt of recognition. Through her, not just attraction, but something deeper, more fundamental. "I feel like I've been waiting to meet you," he said quietly. "Not just romantically, but I don't know how to explain it. Like part of me has been incomplete, and now it's not." Leah's breath caught. She'd felt the same thing, but hadn't found words for it. Standing there with Ellie's hand in hers, she experienced a sensation she'd never had before, the feeling of being truly seen, understood at a level that went beyond words or shared experiences. When he kissed her for the first time, it wasn't the tentative exploration of new lovers, but something that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place she'd never been, but somehow always known. As they broke apart, Leah felt a shift in her carefully constructed world. For the first time in her life, she wanted to let someone all the way in. 2 months felt like 2 years in the best possible way. Leah had never experienced time moving both slowly and quickly, simultaneously, slow in the sense that every moment with Eli felt rich and full, quick in how the weeks blurred together, in a haze of shared mornings, collaborative evenings, and conversations that stretched into dawn. They developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market in Union Square, where Eli would buy ingredients for elaborate breakfast experiments, while Leah captured candid moments of vendors and customers. Sunday afternoons in his apartment, where she'd edit photos, while he read, both of them comfortable in the shared silence. Weeknight dinners that turned into lengthy discussions about art, family, the strange loneliness of being unmoored from your origins. Leah had started leaving clothes at his place without discussing it, and Eli had cleared drawer space without being asked. Her camera equipment had migrated to a corner of his living room, and his vintage camera collection had found its way onto her bookshelf. They were building something together, without the usual negotiations and boundaries that marked new relationships. "I've never been good at this," Leah confessed one evening as they cooked dinner together in his kitchen. She was chopping vegetables while he worked on some complex sauce that required constant stirring. The domestic stuff, sharing space. I usually get claustrophobic. But you don't now? Eli asked, not looking up from his pan. No, she said, surprised by her own certainty. It's weird. I feel more like myself when I'm with you, not less. Usually being around someone all the time makes me feel like I'm performing some version of who I think they want me to be. Eli set down his wooden spoon and turned to face her. I know exactly what you mean. I've spent most of my adult relationships feeling like I was trying to convince someone to love me. With you, it just is. That night, as they lay tangled together in his bed, Leah found herself studying Ellie's sleeping face in the dim light from the street. There was something about his features that continued to strike her as familiar, though she couldn't place why. Maybe it was just that she'd been photographing him constantly candid shots, that he pretended to protest but secretly loved, formal portraits where she experimented with lighting and shadow to capture different aspects of his personality. She'd been thinking more about her biological family lately, partly because of conversations with Eli, but also because their relationship had awakened a curiosity about where her capacity for love had come from. Her foster families had been kind but distant, teaching her survival skills rather than emotional intimacy. Yet with Eli, she found herself capable of a depth of feeling that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her. Learned experience. One rainy Thursday evening, as they browsed through a bookstore in the village, Eli brought up the subject that had been hovering at the edges of their conversations for weeks. I think I want to look for them, he said quietly, running his finger along the spine of a photography book. My birth parents, I mean. Leah felt something shift in her chest, excitement mixed with an inexplicable anxiety. What changed your mind? You, partly, he said, glancing at her with a slight smile. Being with you has made me realize how much I want to understand where I came from, not because I need them, but because I want to understand myself better. And maybe I want to understand us better, us, the way we fit together. It's not normal. Leah, people don't usually connect like this. Maybe there's something in my history that would explain it. That night, Leah lay awake listening to Ellie's steady breathing and wrestling with a decision she hadn't realized she was considering. His words had triggered something in her, a sudden urgent need to know her own origins. Not just casual curiosity anymore, but a pressing desire to understand the genetic threads that had woven her into existence. The next morning, while Eli was in the shower, she found herself searching online for information about accessing sealed adoption records in New York. The process was more complicated than she'd expected, involving court petitions and potential waiting periods, but it was possible. For the first time in her life, the unknown felt more compelling than the safety of not knowing. By the time Eli emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist and hair still damp, Leah had made her decision. I want to look too, she said without preamble. He stopped in the middle of reaching for his clothes. Yeah, let's do it together. Whatever we find, we'll face it together. The word together hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them fully understood. Yet, the paperwork took 3 weeks to process. 3 weeks during which Leah found herself swinging between anticipation and dread. She'd thrown herself into a new photography project, a series on urban solitude, partly to stay busy and partly because she had a feeling that whatever she discovered about her past might change how she saw the world. Eli had been patient with her mood swings, understanding in a way that made her love him even more fiercely. They'd submitted their requests on the same day, treating it like a shared adventure rather than individual quests. The night they'd mailed their petitions, they'd celebrated with expensive wine and talked about hypothetical scenarios. Maybe their birth parents lived in the same city. Maybe they'd discover they had siblings. Maybe the mystery of their unusual connection would finally make sense. The brown envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning while Eli was at work. Leah almost waited for him to come home before opening it, but her curiosity won over her desire to share the moment. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and carefully slit open the seal. The first document was straightforward, a birth certificate with information she'd expected. Born at Mount Sinai Hospital, mother listed as Rebecca Chen, age 19, student, father unknown. But it was the second document that made her hands start trembling. Birth record indicates twin birth. Male infant placed in separate adoption proceeding. Twin. She had a twin brother. Leah's mind raced as she continued reading. The babies had been separated immediately, placed with different agencies to ensure they wouldn't accidentally find each other and complicate their new family's dynamics. It was standard practice in the early 1990s, the caseworker's notes explained. Twins were harder to place together, and separation was considered to be in everyone's best interest. The file contained more details: birth weight, health records, even a few photos of her as an infant. But it was the final document that stopped her heart entirely. A medical form listing identifying characteristics of both babies for future reference. Male twin, distinctive birthmark on left shoulder blade, approximately 2 inches. Crescent-shaped. Leah had seen that birthmark. She'd photographed it, traced it with her fingers, kissed it in the dark. Her coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor as she stood up too quickly, but she barely registered the sound. Her mind was trying to process information that didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, shouldn't be possible. Eli had that birthmark. Eli, who'd been adopted in New York at the same time she was. Eli, who felt like coming home in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. Eli, who shared her unexplainable artistic sensibilities and understood her in ways that had seemed magi. The room spun around her as the implications crashed over her in waves. They weren't lovers who'd found each other across the city's vastness. They were siblings who'd been separated at birth and had unknowingly fallen in love. Leah barely made it to the bathroom before she was sick for the rest of the afternoon. She sat on her living room floor, surrounded by the scattered documents, trying to find some other explanation. Maybe there were multiple babies with crescent-shaped birthmarks. Maybe the records were wrong. Maybe this was some cosmic mistake that would resolve itself if she just waited long enough. But deep down, she knew. The familiar feeling she'd had when she first saw Eli wasn't attraction, it was recognition. The way they moved in sync, understood each other's thoughts, felt incomplete apart. It wasn't fate bringing two strangers together. It was biology calling separated halves back to wholeness. When Ellie's key turned in the lock that evening, Leah was still sitting on the floor, the documents arranged around her like evidence in a crime scene. He took one look at her face and dropped his bag by the door. "What happened?" he asked, crossing the room to kneel beside her. Leah couldn't speak. Instead, she handed him the medical form with the birthmark description highlighted in yellow. She watched his face as he read, watched the confusion give way to understanding, then to horror. "No," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers. "No, this can't be." But even as he said it, she could see the recognition in his eyes, the same recognition she'd been feeling for months, finally given context that made everything terrifyingly clear. They stared at each other across the wreckage of their relationship, to people who'd thought they were writing a love story, but had accidentally authored a tragedy instead. Neither of them slept that night. They sat on opposite ends of Leah's couch. The documents spread across the coffee table between them like a barrier neither could cross. Every few minutes, one of them would start to speak, then stop, realizing there were no words for the situation. "We should have known," Eli said finally, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Shouldn't we have known?" Leah pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. "How could we have known? We were babies when they separated us. We had no conscious memory, no way to recognize each other. But the connection we felt was real," she finished. "It was real, but it wasn't what we thought it was." The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. They'd found each other, just not in the way they'd imagined. The missing piece they'd both been searching for their entire lives had been sitting right there, but the context was all wrong. The love they'd felt deep, immediate, consuming was legitimate, but it was the wrong kind of love. Or maybe it was the right kind, just expressed in the wrong way. Eli had received his documents that afternoon at work, but hadn't opened them yet. Now he tore through the envelope with shaking hands, though they both knew what he'd find. The same mother's name, the same hospital, the same date. Female twin, the report noted, with no identifying characteristics listed. 30 years, Leah whispered. We lived in the same city for 30 years and never met until now. Maybe that's for the best, Eli said bitterly. Maybe the universe was trying to protect us from this. But Leah wasn't sure. Looking back over the past few months, she could see how inevitable their meeting had been. They'd frequented the same galleries, the same coffee shops, the same bookstores. Their paths had been circling each other for years, gradually tightening until collision became unavoidable. "I need you to leave," she said suddenly, the words feeling like physical objects she had to push out of her throat. Eli looked up sharply. "Leah, I can't process this with you here. I can't look at you right now without seeing." She gestured helplessly at the space between them, at the impossible situation they'd created without meaning to. "We can figure this out," Eli said desperately. "We can get counseling. We can learn how to be siblings instead of lovers." The word felt toxic in her mouth. "Eli, we can't just flip a switch and change what we've been to each other. I've been intimate with you. I've been in love with you. How do I take that back?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the helplessness in his voice almost broke her resolve. "I need time," she said firmly. "I need space to understand what this means." Eli stood slowly, like an old man instead of someone who'd been young and vital. "Just hours before." "How much time?" "I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't see each other for a while. Maybe we need to figure out who we are separately before we can figure out who we are together." "Are you saying goodbye?" The question came out strangled. Leah closed her eyes against the pain in his voice. "I'm saying I need to learn how to be your sister instead of someone who's in love with you. And I don't know how to do that while you're still here, still looking at me like I love you." He finished quietly. "Yeah." Eli gathered his things and silenced the few items that had migrated to her apartment. Over the months of building a life together, his favorite coffee mug, the book he'd been reading, the vintage light meter he'd left on her dresser, each object felt like another small death. At the door, he paused with his hand on the knob. "I'll always love you," he said without turning around. "Just not the way I thought I did." After he left, Leah sat in her empty apartment and tried to remember who she'd been before Eli. But that person felt like a stranger now, someone who'd existed in a different lifetime when the world made sense and love was simple, and family was something other people had. She'd found her family, finally, and in finding them, she'd lost everything. 6 months later, Leah stood in the center of an empty gallery space, adjusting the final photograph in her series Love, Mistaken. The opening was tomorrow night, and she'd been preparing for weeks, though part of her wondered if she was ready to share this story with the world. The photographs told their story without words, images of hands reaching for each other, but never quite touching, shadows walking in opposite directions, empty beds with rumpled sheets, reflections in windows that showed two figures where there should have been one. The technical quality was some of her best work, each image sharp with the kind of precision that came from channeling pain into art. She hadn't seen Eli since that night 6 months ago. Though they'd exchanged a few careful text messages, he'd moved to Portland for a new job, putting physical distance between them that matched the emotional chasm they'd discovered. He'd started therapy, he'd told her. He was trying to understand how to integrate this new knowledge into his sense of self. Leah had thrown herself into work, accepting assignments that kept her traveling, staying in motion so she wouldn't have to sit still with the weight of what they'd learned. But eventually, she'd had to come home and face it. She'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in adoption issues, someone who helped her understand that what they'd experienced, while rare, wasn't unheard of. Genetic sexual attraction. The clinical term felt cold and inadequate for the complexity of what they'd felt. "We're not the first," her therapist had said gently, "and you're not bad people for feeling what you felt. You were responding to real, biological connections in the only context you had." The understanding helped intellectually. Emotionally, the shame and confusion lingered. The centerpiece of the gallery show was a triptych, 3 large photographs mounted side by side. The first showed two shadows cast by the same light source, overlapping perfectly. The second showed the same shadows beginning to separate. The third showed them moving in opposite directions, growing fainter as they moved away from their source. Beneath the triptych, a small placard read, sometimes we find a part of ourselves in someone else, but not every echo is meant to be followed. On opening night, Leah stood near the entrance, watching people move through the space, reading the story she'd told through images. Some viewers lingered longer than others, and she wondered what they saw in the photographs, what stories they projected onto her carefully composed frames. Near closing time, she noticed a familiar figure at the far end of the gallery. Eli stood before the triptych, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the images with the same careful attention he'd once given to photographs in other galleries. In what felt like another lifetime, Leah's heart hammered as she approached him, and she realized she was nervous, not with the charged energy of attraction she'd once felt, but with the awkward uncertainty of meeting a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger. "Hi," she said quietly when she reached his side. "Hi." He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the photographs. "These are beautiful, painful, but beautiful. How are you?" The question felt both inadequate and essential. "I'm okay," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. "Different, but okay. Portland's been good for me. I'm seeing someone, a therapist. Learning how to process all of this. I'm glad." They stood in silence for a moment, to people who'd shared everything, now struggling to navigate the simplest conversation. "I think about you," Eli said finally. "Not the way I used to, but I wonder if you're okay. If you're happy." "I'm getting there," Leah replied honestly. "Some days are harder than others." "Do you think," he paused, seeming to gather courage, "do you think we could ever be siblings, really?" Leah considered the question she'd been asking herself for months. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe someday. But right now, I think we need to be strangers for a while longer. We need to figure out who we are without each other before we can figure out who we might be together." Eli nodded, and she could see the disappointment in his expression, but also understanding. "Will you tell me when you're ready, if you're ever ready?" "Yeah," she promised. "I will." As the gallery began to empty, Eli prepared to leave. At the entrance, he turned back one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad we found each other, even if it wasn't the way we thought, even if it hurt. I'd rather know you exist than spend the rest of my life feeling like something was missing." After he left, Leah remained in the gallery, surrounded by the photographs that told their story. Tomorrow, she'd take them down and move on to the next project, the next attempt to make sense of the world through her lens. But tonight, she stood in the space between what was and what could never be, finally at peace with the strange, painful gift of knowing where she came from. The gallery lights dimmed around her as she gathered her things, ready to step back into a world where love was complicated and family was complex. And sometimes the most profound connections were the ones you had to walk away from. Question for reflection: when fate brings two people together in the most unlikely circumstances, is the connection they feel diminished by the context in which they discover it? Can love be both real and impossible at the same time? And how do we reconcile the heart's truth with life's cruel ironies?